So this is the next of our videos regarding King Lear and the extracts that might be used for paper 1 English Literature AQA, the tragedy paper. So we look at the same approaches as ever to our next section, which is the latter part of Act 1 Scene 2. So we've seen Edmund give his initial soliloquy at the start of the scene, and we've seen him deceive Gloucester with this fake letter. We're now going to look at the end of that scene in which he encounters Edgar. It's Edgar's first appearance in the play, and we're going to look from lines about 111 to 174, so slightly longish for the exam, but a good sequence to look at. So there's our usual tactics to approach the scene with, and we can begin by locating the passage as obviously after that big opening scene, but also after the revelation of the true nature of Edmund, and we've seen him very smartly and resourcefully, in a rather Machiavellian way, Machiavelli being the sort of cynical plotter and schemer in Elizabethan and Jacobean thinking. We've seen him scheme and plot to defeat his own father, Gloucester, and we're now going to see him carry that plot further by manipulating Edgar. Structurally, in the scene, this is a kind of midpoint in the scene, and the bit we're going to begin with is the bit where we see Edmund have another soliloquy, not in verse this time, a less formal soliloquy, therefore, and a slightly more conspiratorial one. So we're going to look at, so we sort of thought about how this is the beginning of the subplot, and that's still part of that thinking as we locate this passage. The basic narrative of the scene is going to be around Edgar's gullibility and how he says very little in the scene as Edmund sort of pushes and twists him into thinking he's in danger. And so we'll see the development of Edmund and Edgar's characters here. And various themes always appear, as we'll see. Language-wise, it's really that kind of lack of speech by Edgar that we'll notice particularly. One of the things that we will look at here before we look at the actual scene is a reminder of that table that told us kind of who was in the play the most. And we can see that, interestingly, Gloucester and Kent are in the most scenes, but Lear has the most lines by a long way. The second most lines come for Edgar. He has 2,857 individual lines and 392 individual speeches, so he has most speeches after Lear and the most lines. He's also in a significant number of scenes, 10. So that kind of idea that it's somehow Edgar's play is one that we constantly need to consider, because he's such an overlooked character, really, or he's an easy character to overlook. So let's turn to the sequence. Here we begin with this fantastic speech by Edmund. As I say, it is in prose, but he's just heard his father say, oh, these late eclipses, oh, it's all in the stars, it's astrology, everything's going wrong because of the nature of the alignment of the stars. And he says this is the foppery, the stupidity. Notice his dismissive language there of the world, that we create our own problems. We are usually the surfeit of our own behaviour. Usually the reason things are going wrong for us is because we've behaved badly in some way. And instead we blame the sun, the moon and the stars. And again, his language is direct and forceful and dismissive and cynical in this brilliant speech. And ironic, full of sort of irony bordering on sarcasm. And he lists all the sort of misbehaviours that people might blame on, oh, it's not my fault, it's in the stars. And again, it's that lack of illusion, lack of any sense that there's anything else to blame or to consider than the reality in front of us. And nature itself, as he said at the beginning of this scene, he's got us, this is the real world, and anything else is just illusion and nonsense. Sometimes a sort of comforting illusion is what he's kind of hinting at there too. And then he jokes that, he was born under a certain star and so he should be a certain way. And he's very quick to dismiss that tut, that forceful dismissal. I should have been that I am, had the maidenly star in the firmament twinkled on my bastardizing. I would have been however I am, no matter what star was above me when I was born. I am Edmund, and I'm kind of as I am by something running very deep and profound. And then Edgar comes in. And as he comes in, we get a last aside from Edmund, which again implicates us with Edmund and makes us sort of think of Edgar as a ridiculous figure, just as the foppery of Gloucester is now replaced by the catastrophe of the old comedy. Like cue is villainous melancholy. So he looks at him as a sort of comic, ridiculous figure that's going to cause catastrophe, that's going to lead to some disaster, but a comic disaster, really. He's not even a sort of tragic, catastrophic figure. There's nothing tragic about Edgar. Edgar is foolish, foppish, silly. And so he pretends, he says he's going to side like Tom of Bedlam, which of course is one of our early hints around what's going to happen to Edgar himself. As here, Edmund says, I'm going to pretend to make a noise like Tom of Bedlam, and Bedlam was the Bethlehem hospital where lunatics, mentally ill people were placed. Tom of Bedlam was the sort of beggars, the mentally ill beggars that would be seen around the place, crying out and behaving in delusional ways. Now that's the disguise that Edgar's going to put on. So it's that theme of madness again, and what's mad and what's not. But we know here that Edmund puts the act on in a very cynical and manipulative way, whereas later we'll see Edgar put the same act on in a desperate way because it's his only defence, he thinks, against being murdered for crimes he hasn't committed. So he picks up, notice again here, typical of Edmund, he picks up on what he's just heard and uses it. So Gloucester was muttering about eclipses and astrology, so he thinks, oh, well, I'll do that too. I'll sort of mutter something around that because that seems to be a useful way to make Edgar believe what I'm about to say, perhaps to undermine Edgar's suspicions by making him think that Edmund is foolish and therefore not to be doubted and feared. And again, he puts on an act to draw the question, what contemplation are you in? So what is Edgar? He comes in, he asks a rather serious question about a serious contemplation. He uses rather sort of academic language. He's often sort of therefore seen as a student wearing glasses with books in his hand, somebody who's drawn into the world of studious endeavour but doesn't really see the world as it is around him. And so Edmund plays up this idea that he's been thinking about the late eclipses and what they might portend. And of course, Edgar's dismissive of that. Do you busy yourself with that? Are you interested in that rubbish? So Edgar is dismissive of it, but not in the same cynical way that Edmund is. Edmund dismisses eclipses and astrology as just empty foolishness. Edgar as bad scholarship. There's not scholastic evidence for this stuff, so he doesn't trust it. Edmund continues there in the next speech with, rather, Shakespeare loves his list, death, dearth, dissolutions, ancient amenities, but notice the repetition of the D's is false, overuse of alliteration, which really hints to the actor. This is an act that Edmund is putting on here. We shouldn't take this too seriously. So again, he pulls at menaces and maledictions. It's a big, noisy little speech here. It's a small speech but big in scale, as he's trying to show a side of himself that's totally not him at all, as somebody who's upset and worried and anxious by these latest predictions from the stars. And again, Edgar's rather kind of academic. How long have you been secretary astronomical? It sounds rather formal and detached from the kind of realism of Edmund. And that is enough. Edmund controls the conversation, sets the agenda. Come, when saw you my father last. So he's basically used that beginning of the scene to disarm Edgar, to make him feel superior to Edmund and a bit confused, and just generally sort of feeling that Edmund is a rather silly and foolish figure. And then he suddenly switches like an interrogator's turning the lamp into the eyes of the victim and says, okay, when did you see your dad last? And it just really catches him off guard. His response, again, notice Edgar gets very few words, just very short speeches. You get the sense that Edmund drives this conversation. Why, by the night gone by, I suppose we could say that at this point this switch doesn't hit home to Edgar, this switch in tone, and he just dismisses it as irrelevant. Who cares when I saw Dad last? But Edmund's questioning sort of just starts to make him uneasy. Speak with him, 2 hours together, what are you talking about? Again, Edgar's, what's he doing at this point? We often see him portrayed on stage as looking in books, maybe, and studying things. And so, he's kind of caught up, he's picking things off a library wall, a library shelf, and he's not really listening very much to Edmund. That's one way of sort of showing him to be detached and easily deceived, therefore. He's not taking in quite the drive that Edmund's sort of enacting upon him. And then we get to the essence. Pied you on good terms, found you no displeasure. None at all. And then Edmund twists the knife, bethink you. Notice the imperatives. Suddenly Edmund is driving very clear this conversation, has the agenda totally in his control. Did you displease him in any way? And notice the language builds from displeasure to so rageth in him that mischief of your person would scarcely allay. So, he's going to attack you. And this does alarm Edgar, but again, he has very little to say. Some villain has done me wrong, which is, of course, hilariously ironic. It must be hard for the actor playing Edmund not to roll his eyes and wink at the audience there, because some villain has done him wrong and he's talking to him. Edmund is the villain who has done him wrong. Villain meant sort of low-born person, essentially, but also contained the idea, was beginning to contain the idea of bad guy. Edmund plays his act up, that's my fear, very pious and, is protective and supportive. But again, the word rage is thrown in there, and if you do stir abroad, go armed. So there's a real sense of the danger being ramped up very quickly. And Edgar picks that up. Armed, brother? Are you kidding? What? Clearly, just like Gloucester before him in the previous section of the scene, Edgar has fallen straight into Edmund's traps and totally believes everything he says. And again, Edmund has won the day very neatly and easily here. Brother, I advise you to go the best go armed. He seems like he's supporting him. He's on his side. I'm advising you. Just listen to me and everything will be fine. And Edgar is foolish enough to go along with it. I do serve you in this business. Well, there's a lot of irony in that too. Of course, he doesn't serve him in the sense of looking after him. Rather, he's actually serving up lots of things that are causing this business to happen. And as soon as Edgar goes, we get the final speech in the scene. Quite short, but back into verse, in fact. So a little bit more formal. A rounding off of the scene with a bit of rhyme too in the final couplet to say, I win. They've fallen for it. Credulous father, a father who believes anything, a brother noble. Oh, he's so noble that he can't even guess that anybody could deceive him. And so his nature's so far from doing harm, he suspects none. He's so good that he doesn't even suspect anybody else could be bad. His foolish honesty. So in this world of Edmund's, everybody who's honest is foolish. This is your Machiavellian, in essence. Somebody who says, well, there's no point in being honest because you don't thrive by that, and other people will lie. And my practice is right easy, He's just celebrating here his success in tricking him. And then we get that absolutely key quotation, I see the business. And there's our theme of sight again. Who sees and who doesn't? Edmund sees things really clearly, sees exactly how things are. He sees the business. That's his slogan. That's his motto. I see the business. And all with me's meet that I can fashion fit. Meet as in good, fitting. Everything's right for me if I can make it work for me. And that's very, again, his essence. He makes everything in his environment work to his interests. Everything he hears and picks up on, he quickly uses for his own advantage. He's very resourceful. He's the kind of essence of the psycho or sociopath who has no conscience at all, but is ruthlessly able to make the most out of every situation in front of him, and succeeds because of it. We are drawn into his world because he begins and ends this sequence, and as he begins and ends the whole scene by talking directly to us, sharing in his duplicity, in his lies and cheats, making us feel that we're kind of part of his gang, if you like. We're in on it. We're planning with him the deceptions that he's going to get away with. And so within quite a brief scene, really just less than 200 lines, everything has been set up in the subplot too now. That Edmund is the only person, as we've seen in the whole play so far, who is in control of everything. Even Gonal and Regan felt rather at the mercy of their father's moods and whims. They've tried to shape a bit of control towards the end of the first scene. Obviously, Ken tried to control things and failed. Lear thinks he's controlling things, but he's not, because he's making terrible mistakes. Cordelia tried to control things by refusing to speak, but that has ended again with a sort of disruption of her life, and nothing very positive for her. So Gloucester, of course, and Edgar are totally out of control, have no control of anything. So only Edmund seems to be the real person who can control the situation, see the business. And we'll see that through most of the play up to the final scene, he thrives very well on that. And that seems to be the pessimistic message of the play in some ways, that these sort of people, these ruthless, cynical characters, will do very well in life. They will thrive for a long time, because the rest of us are either too foolish, too blind, too mad, too self-absorbed to realise that they are doing things to us which, are disadvantaging us and giving them everything they need. So lots here to show the power of Edmund, not much to show Edgar. This guy who's in the play more than anybody else in some ways, or certainly has more lines and speeches than everyone but Lear. He is just a background, very short single sentence lines all the way through the scene, often reduced to just 2 words, for instance, being pushed around, being manipulated, being hurried and rushed into making foolish decisions, not asking the questions he really should. So again, it's the big challenge of any production of the play to make Edgar interesting. And I think what we could sort of see is that sort of vulnerability, the genuine good-heartedness of him, the seeking out of the truth and goodness in life, and then his vulnerability because he can't quite imagine how bad people can be, and how his life is quite comfortable up to this point in a kind of uninteresting way. And he's now going to be totally thrown out of his comfort zone. He's going to be challenged. He's going to be changed. And he's going to, perhaps some inner power is going to come out in the stuff that he says and acts when he pretends to be Tom of Bedlam. Is a kind of cathartic outpouring of an inner torment, I think. But what that inner torment might be is never really clear. He's never really given any backstory as to what might be his discontents, whereas we can see with Edmund and Gonal and Regan why they're unhappy with their lives. But there's a fury about the outpouring of his griefs in his pretending to be mad later in the play that makes us think that perhaps Shakespeare's saying that we've all got this inner turmoil that we need to voice in order to release our true selves. However, how far we actually side with Edgar is very doubtful, particularly later on in the famous end to the play where he says the gods are just, in talking about his own father's death and blindness. We seem to see him as someone with a very kind of harsh view of justice there, and perhaps a rather naive view of the world, that it will all be right in the end, whereas it's hard to see that everything's right in the end, at the end of this play, where only perhaps Edgar and Albany are left standing. However, in summary, this scene shows Edmund's power.